Welcome back to my garden. Earlier this week, I received fairly sad news that a friend of mine had died in some sort of accident. Details are a little sketchy, but it sounded ghastly. Anyway, well, you'd know that if you were one of my Facebook friends. I posted a tribute and some photographs. But it's been on my mind, and this channel is, I suppose, a handy sort of escape valve. And actually, what I've been thinking about, provoked by the accident, has everything to do with the themes that I've been following over the last few months. The tribute that I wrote on Facebook, it doesn't have a title, but if it had a title, it would have been something connected to my opening idea, which is that the phrase "one of a kind" is somewhat overused. Everything's one of a kind these days, unique, and all the rest. Stuff, experiences, and of course people. And for the most part, nothing could be further from the truth. But Andrew Mitchell was, I think anyone who knew him would agree, genuinely deserving of that epithet. He really was a singular fellow, incredibly well liked. I don't think I ever heard anyone say a bad word about him. Fantastic company, and a tragic loss to his family and all the people who knew him and the community where he lived. Now, I knew him through the Kite Flyers. He was the brother of my head at the school where I was working in Lima, Peru. And our football team would go on these regular tours, and one of the places that sort of cropped up from time to time as a venue was Moquegua in the south of Brazil, because Andrew lived there. He lived in this small village, and it was an obvious place to go, and the various tours that took place there were all fantastic. But I also knew him because he'd worked at the school where I worked, off and on. Occasionally he did little stints there. But I was fortunate enough to visit him, I think probably 4 times. The first and last on my own, the 2 in the middle with friends. And they were fantastic trips and full of stories and if I'm being really honest, probably far too much Pisco than is good for you. Pisco, for those not in the know, is a powerful grape brandy. It's, I suppose, has a mythological status in Peru, rather like cachaça has in Brazil. And Moquegua is a sort of in a Pisco-producing region, and Andrew, when you visited him, would take you to all manner of obscure little hole in the walls, and he had a good friend who was actually a small-time distiller of great Pisco. But as I said in the story, the tribute rather, that I wrote on Facebook, the reason that Andrew stayed in my memory all these years was because every so often, and I've mentioned these assemblies that I'm going to reference now on this channel before, every so often at my school in Sao Paulo, I would do an assembly on Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Buddhist monk's recipe for happiness. And I found this recipe in a book that I stumbled upon when I was on my very first trip to visit Andy, archaeologists used to stay. He lived in and had a sort of half-finished hotel. That's the best way I can describe it. At any rate, I'd stayed in the room where the archaeologists stayed, and they'd left behind this book by Thich Nhat Hanh, and his advice for happiness was to breathe gently and walk caressing the earth, with your feet caressing the earth. Fantastic advice. And as I said in my tribute, it did seem to me, on reflection, besides the fact that I'd always think about Andy every time it was time to do the assembly again. And I probably had gaps of a year or so, a year or two, and they were different groups. But it was the sort of advice you'd want to share with anyone. Breathe gently, walk caressing the earth. And if you do those two things consistently, you'll be a much happier person. And I think it's true. So every time I had one of these assemblies, of course, I'd find myself daydreaming about those trips to the south of Peru and what a fantastic time I had and how great it would be to see Andrew again. And in writing the tribute, it struck me how, I suppose coincidentally, but maybe it's just how we serendipitously sort of put things together, but how Andrew seemed to be the perfect embodiment of living that life, because he really was a kind of gentle soul who moved in I don't want to say language, who moved in a very kind-spirited sort of way through the world as he passed through. And of course he'll be enormously missed. Well, that's what I wrote in this tribute, and I suppose it does no harm repeating the story, because most of you probably haven't read my little piece on Facebook. But it did, writing the piece, set another wheel in motion in my mind, which I suppose I've mentioned a lot on this channel before too. Because when you start thinking about people, loved ones or friends that you've lost, and certainly thinking about them in the context of, joining the merry band of those who do write eulogies, tributes, memories, share them on Facebook. That's how I found out about his passing. It randomly popped up in a feed of another friend who had written a very touching and warm-hearted story about his first meeting with Andrew. And I guess it got me thinking, well, first of all, that I do seem to know a lot of people, or how can I put this? It struck me that, is it perhaps unusual, the number of people I know? I'm 56, I'm not of that age when it's very common, but I do seem to know an enormous number of people who have sadly left us. Maybe one of the reasons is, some might argue I moved in fairly rum circles, but no, that's not it. Or perhaps an element of it is, as an international school teacher, I just know a lot of people. So perhaps I get a larger sample size of the actuarial table to draw on. So I know a few more than most who might have sadly passed away. I think the biggest reason that I do sometimes have this feeling that, wow, I know a lot of people who've tragically aren't with us anymore. I mean, it's the same as we all have that feeling sometimes that a lot of famous people seem to have passed away last year. And of course, it's not more, statistically speaking, than probably is true any other year. It's just that we live in a information-rich age where we are so much more connected. So a friend that you knew from, I suppose the last time I saw Andrew, my last visit to him was in 2004, 20 years ago, another country. But you find out about it because we are super connected. And that brings home that point that, well, you will be remembered. And perhaps if there's a message, and certainly a message to share when it's someone like Andrew who is remembered so fondly, so well, memento mori. You know, we don't know when our time is, but make the most of it, and perhaps start living your life. It is a very macabre sort of message, but how do you want to be remembered? Start writing the life that will be the sort of tribute or eulogy that you would want when your time comes to pass. And draw inspiration from these people. It's something that struck me when at my mother-in-law's funeral. And she was a universally well-respected and loved person, iconic, here in the village where I live, in Paripuera. And everyone was coming up to me saying how wonderful she was and what an incredible person and what she did. And at a certain point, I said to a friend, maybe this is the sort of biting remark when you're feeling a slightly raw and perhaps more unfiltered than is good. But I made a kind of biting remark about some of these comments to a friend of mine, saying, you know, what would be nice isn't for so many people to come up saying how marvellous she was, because she was incredibly charitable and seemingly of perpetual good cheer and very generous and grew things and treated absolutely everyone with respect, people and animals. If a bird fell out of a nest, she would hand rear it and reintroduce it into the wild. She was a remarkable lady. And I said to this friend of mine, what people need to do isn't say how fantastic she was, just find one little thing, one small crumb that they can build on, and just take that one little thing and do it themselves. You don't have to be saintly, but at least find one thing that wonderful person did and make it a part of your life. And if everyone did that and did it quietly, and we had no shared memories and gushing prose about the marvels of this person, but we did have a whole community who found something to draw inspiration from and kept that spirit alive, well, the world would be a much better place. Of course, it's a lot easier at those moments when we feel sad and not unreasonable to share how much we value that person. It's much harder to do what they did, and of course they are, I guess, one of a kind because they are quite rare. And that brings me back really to the point I made at the beginning, that Does this connect to what I've been talking about? And I think it does. Andrew, I said he was, he was a remarkable guy, but he wasn't a remarkable guy in the fact that he did extraordinary things that the world knows about. He was remarkable because he was so truly and positively authentic. He was genuinely himself all the time, in the very best way possible. And perhaps that's something we can aspire to, to simply, in these sad moments, to be the best, most authentic version of ourselves as much as we possibly can. And dare I say it, that really would be self-actualization. Anyway, that's it for this week. Trust your lives are filled with joy. And until next week, sunny Brazil. Ciao.